So, for those of you who are really genuinely uncertain about the validity of all these conspiracy theories, you know, for those of you who actually are genuinely debating the validity of some of these, even some of these apparently well-researched conspiracies, doing some research of myself to make this little video you're about to see really brought back some existential anxiety that I was very immersed in like 10 years ago, and I really just felt the need to make a short introductory. I wrote up a brief little list. You guys can see it there. So I think the appeal of conspiracies is that, well, first of all, let's be transparent, as so many people claim to be, but really aren't. My personal position is one of ignorance. I can't verify nor debunk pretty much any of these theories. There's a lot of evidence for and against, but there's also a lot of lazy gluing together of incoherent facts, and you know, whether there's some that are true or not, I guess my perspective is that once you go down that rabbit hole, I went down the bunny hole of Shane Dawson last night for like an hour and a half. I didn't realize, honestly, he had, because I saw a couple of you mention him in the last video. I didn't know he was that interested in conspiracies, but it really made me get introspective about what it is that's so gripping about conspiracies. And I have a couple quotes that I think will help get a sense of objectivity about them, so you're not so immersed in your subjective feeling of almost disorientation, because it really does flip entire worldviews that you're used to hearing on their head. I think it's good to be open-minded. It's good to be inquisitive. You know, Socrates said the unexamined life is a life that's not worth living, and I agree with that. So there's great value in skepticism. But the quote, the Serenity Prayer, apparently, I had to look it up. I had to look all these quotes up to get them exact, which can be traced back. You've all heard this one. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Now that goes back all the way to the Greek Stoic, 50 years AD, Epictetus. It's been traced to the 8th century AD Indian Buddhist Shantideva, the 11th century Jewish scholar Solomon Ibn, I don't know how to pronounce that, Ibn Gabriel, and even a 1695 Mother Goose poem. But the best known form is the one I just read to you. And I think that's a really concise way of a nice, extremely valuable nugget of wisdom to carry around with you, especially when you start looking into conspiracies. You know, Carl Sagan in his famous series Cosmos famously said, it's actually called the Sagan Standard nowadays, I guess. But it's an aphorism that he, I think, came up with that said, or at least popularized, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Extraordinary evidence. And I think that's another great nugget of wisdom, packed with so much valuable advice. These conspiracies connect a lot of dots. We're humans and we're really good at pulling patterns out of noise. Sometimes the patterns are there, like when a tiger is lurking in tall straw or grass, dry brown grass in the savannah, and we see its face. But there's plenty of times when there isn't anything there. Patterns in clouds, noise in static, even one of the Shane Dawson ones, the alternate, well, the Laurel Yanny thing. It comes down to, you know, the Yanny pattern was unintentional. It was originally on dictionary.com. It was the, what do you call it, the stock pronunciation audio clip for the word laurel. That one girl who was doing a research paper and needed to look up the word laurel, I guess she just clicked the little speaker volume icon next to it in the male voice that said laurel. Through her ears, she heard the very high frequency notes of that guy's voice and the digitization and the extreme compression that it went through, and was able to make out the word Yanny from it. And that all boiled down to an being explained by the fact that some people can hear at higher frequencies than others. I point all that out to distinguish extrapolation and speculation from scientific, verifiable facts, observations, empirical claims, reproducible claims. There's so many conspiracies out there that it can really overwhelm you, I think. And so I think what helped me understand and take a 30,000 foot view from, you know, the plane that the chemtrails are maybe getting spit out of. Sometimes you need to take a step back, take a big breath, recognize the thing that you are certain of. What gives us orientation and a feeling of mental health is a desire, a fulfillment of the desire to understand how things work. And in our world, it's too complex to understand everything. So you naturally, inevitably, necessarily have to tune out most things, most sensory input. And your brain's really good at doing that. We've evolved naturally to focus on a narrow band of light and a narrow range of sound and temperature input in the Goldilocks zone that we can survive in, that water exists in its liquid form. The point is, we're evolutionarily adapted for a very, very limited, narrow range of perception. And you have to do that same thing with the world, even with the world that you can perceive. And you have to ground it in fact, something that you know can't be shaken. You can't shake the fact. And that's that we exist. We're conscious. We can control our actions. Right now, you can choose to pause, unsubscribe, dislike this video. And when you do, I might feel a twinge of discomfort and having lost some subscribers, and that's pain. It's a very minute form of pain, but nonetheless, it's there. We are conscious and we suffer. We lack comfort, and that's a negative feeling. We can be sure of that. You put your hand on a hot stove, you can be sure that you exist, whether you're in a simulation or not. You can be sure that you don't want to continue that feeling. And when you learn that, you can be sure that others around you also don't want that same thing to be happening to them. And so, we have to ground ourselves in that thing you can be sure of. And I bet that there's more people out in the world who would prefer to not contribute to the total suffering in the world. And then you recognize that what you do, because you understand what affects you negatively and positively, you can recognize affects other people. And then you think about the 6 degrees of separation between everybody in the world. You're only 6 people away in the network of social interactions from any of the 6 or 7 billion with a B people in the world. And so imagine what actual light we can illuminate, not in the secret or the dark depths of a conspiracy, illegal, negative, evil, well, what's the word? Cabal. But in a public, transparent, local setting, if all of us just paid attention to the things that they knew were real around them and what they could do to make those things better and not worse. If we had a world filled with people like that, making incremental progress day to day, year to year, decade to decade, generation to generation, the world could be a hell of a lot better than it is. And I just think that's something to remember when diving into all these conspiracies. So, I'm going to leave you with one last from a philosopher from the 17th century, 1600s, 400 years ago, recognized that we have a propensity to let our imaginations run wild. He said it best. To counteract that, to make anything very terrible, obscurity seems in general to be necessary when we know the full extent of any danger, when we can accustom our eyes to it. A great deal of the apprehension vanishes. Everyone will be sensible to this line of argument who considers how greatly the night adds to our dread in all cases of danger, and how much the notions of ghosts and goblins or Illuminati secret agendas, whatever, take your pick, of which none can form clear ideas, how much that affects the mind, which gives credit to the popular tales concerning such sorts of things. Those despotic, tyrannical, dictatorial governments, which are founded on the passions of men and women, and principally upon the passion of fear. And remember, this was written 400 years ago, so there was still plenty of that. Those despotic governments keep their chief as much as may be from the public eye, and the policy has been the same in many cases of religion. Almost all the heathen temples were dark, even in the barbarous temples of the Americans at this day. Again, 400 years ago. And they keep their idol in a dark part of the hut, which is consecrated to his worship. For this purpose, too, the Druids performed all their ceremonies in the bosom of the darkest woods, and in the shade of the oldest and most spreading oak trees. And then he goes on to quote a poem by Milton, the famous poet who wrote Paradise Lost. The point is that our imagination grips us. Actually, Jordan Peterson gives the famous example and a way to practically demonstrate how rampant your imagination is when you're alone at night. It's midnight, and you hear a noise coming from a room. So you crack that door, and the room's dark, but you know you have to reach your arm in that dark room and turn on that switch. Well, before you turn on that switch, pause for a minute and just observe yourself and where your mind takes you and what your mind populates that room with. It's not butterflies and unicorns, I can tell you that. So, anyway, they'll have to really, really shorten this. This was a while, but I think it was worth pointing out, because these aren't just unsophisticated, easily debunkable theories. A lot of these are based with video evidence and facts, and I think the mistake is to prematurely piece them together and assume evil. Like, there's another quote I didn't bother to look up, but maybe it's Occam's razor. Always assume the most simple explanation first. And while that's not always true, it's, again, practical and very useful. So, I'll leave you with, before you assume maliciousness, consider stupidity and tribalism and ignorance, arrogance, personal pride, and a lack of love. Yes, why not? Just do what you can with what you have, and let God or whoever grant you wisdom to know the difference. With that said, enjoy the history of the Illuminati. Let's get to it. Well, guys, I think that about sums up our little foray into the history of the Illuminati. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. And, as always, thank you for your support.